Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'd like to present you today a methodology that we use to study the hydrogen defect interaction in nanostructured materials, which means nanocrystalline ultrafine grain. It's a very simple method. It's called high pressure torsion. We simply place a cylindrical shaped sample between two anvils, a lower and a higher one, and under hydrostatic pressure, we transform enormous amounts of shear strains, thousands of strains to the sample. And we usually use this, this technique to process ultrafine grained or even nanocrystalline materials. Today, I would like to show you a different purpose. We use high purity ions, and introduce hydrogen by electrochemical charging. And then we study the effect of the hydrogen decoration during grain, during deformation on structural changes. We chose a high purity ion because it has actually the grain spacing similar to modern complex steels, but it's chemically simple. We only have to deal with trapping at dislocations, boundaries, and vacancies only, but it's more easy to interpret the data. And we want to learn something about the effect of hydrogen during severe straining, because the beauty of this technique is we have a hydrostatic pressure, which means we can prevent early cracking of the material. So we can really study the effect of hydrogen on plasticity beyond the failure limit of the material. It's a multi-step approach. What we are doing in the first step, we electrochemically charge the sample. And because of the higher trap density, we have huge amount of boundaries so we have 200 nanometer grain spacing, huge amount of boundaries, dislocations, vacancies. So of course, we also reach for PCC materials really high hydrogen concentrations of almost 20 ppm. In the next step, we immediately deform the structure either by monotonic rotation of this lower anvil, if you want to study the impact of hydrogen on grain refinement, or we can also cyclically reverse this lower anvil clockwise and anti-clockwise after 5 degrees torsion angle if we want to study the impact of hydrogen on grain coarsening. This would simulate something like an ultra-low cycle fatigue experiment. We assess the effect of hydrogen on the structural changes in a very simple manner. So we are just checking the changes in the microstructure by SEM, EBC, TM, and correlated then to the mechanical changes by measuring micro hardness or doing nano indentation if we have to deal with localization effects. So I would like today talk about the experiments that we do on cyclic HPT. We use it to make hydrogen visible. It's an indirect method to make hydrogen visible. And another asset is that we can really follow the interaction of hydrogen with grain boundaries during deformation, so during severe straining. And then another point I'd like to point out here is due to the high trapping density, we can maintain, despite of this ex situ setup, a rather large hydrogen concentration within the sample. So our initial goal or idea was we were seeking for a methodology to make hydrogen visible in our HPT disk during deformation. With conventional or sophisticated methods, that's not possible. So we were seeking for an indirect measurement tool. What we wanted to know is the hydrogen homogeneously distributed in such a disk? So this is 10 millimeter in diameter, about 1 millimeter in height. Or is it, or does it trap preferentially at stress strain concentrations or small micro cracks? And there we make use of a pinning effect of hydrogen at grain boundaries. In order to understand the next slides, you have to know two things about nanostructured materials. Nanostructured materials, so ultrafine grained nanocrystalline materials, are mechanically unstable. This means if we cyclically load such a structure, we see that the grain size increases tremendously during cyclic loading. So this is the grain structure in a IPF map with increasing cyclic numbers, increasing cyclic accumulated strain. This occurs by continuous migration of high grain boundaries and is correlated with a drop of the microhardness. So we observe grain coarsening and cyclic softening. The second thing we make use of is the fact that with interstitial alloying elements, we can reduce the grain growth amount. So this is an example of nanocrystalline aluminum and oxygen, where we see the higher the oxygen concentration, the lower is the grain size. And this is exactly what we wanted to see now in this experiment. We did kind of and the idea actually was we have two extreme cases. The first one, if we now take this hydrogen charged structure, cyclically deform it, and we do not have cyclic softening, so microhardness maintains, there is no structural change. We know that there is pinning of hydrogen at grain boundaries. So hydrogen must be located at the grain boundaries. The second extreme case would be if we still have cyclic softening, which means drop in the microhardness because the structure coarsens. Clearly, hydrogen cannot be located at the grain boundaries. We have distinct grain growth, and hydrogen must segregate to other spots like stress strain concentrations, like small cracks. Probably it's only in the surface regions and does not diffuse into the entire material, or the most likely case, it would stronger interact with dislocations and vacancies than grain boundaries. So what we actually observe is an intermediate behavior. This is the color IPF map of the predeformed structure, so the starting material. After 10 cycles of cyclic HPT, we have, for the uncharged case, moderate grain coarsening, so grain size increases from 80 up to 170 nanometer. But for the charged case, which is shown here on the right-hand side, we clearly see that the grain size does not change. And this can only be the case if grain boundaries are pinned by hydrogen. So from this, we can conclude, okay, after 10 cycles, there is still hydrogen present at grain boundaries. With increasing the cycle number, we also increase the driving force for grain growth. So we push dislocations into the structure, and so the pressure on the boundary becomes larger. And this means that we cannot prevent grain growth even in the hydrogen charged samples. So it increases up to 300 nanometer for the hydrogen charged case. And this proceeds now also for higher cycle numbers of 250. But in any case, what was interesting to see is even at the larger cycling numbers, so at the larger strains, hydrogen slows down the migration of high grain boundaries. So there must still hydrogen be present at the boundaries. Then we tried to get the overall picture of our HPT disk. This is actually a hardness heat map of the anti-HPT disk. So red is high hardness, blue is low hardness. And what we see for the uncharged case is pretty much what we have expected. So when grain growth sets in, what we have seen from EBSD, cyclic softening occurs. And this is accelerated here in the center of the HPT disk in these yellow regions because a shear band is formed. This is what we know, what we expect. For the hydrogen charged case, we see the other extreme. There is no grain coarsening. We know this from the EBSD measurements, but what was interesting to see is there is no shear localization at all. So hydrogen seems actually to decrease localization tendencies in such nanostructured materials. For higher cycling numbers, so higher strains, more dislocations are introduced into the sample. We see now also cyclic softening. We see the formation of a shear band, but compared to the uncharged case, we do see that it remains at a higher hardness, and also the shear band itself is more confined. So here it's extended nearly over the entire HBD disk, and for the hydrogen charged case, it's way smaller. And this holds true now also for higher cycle numbers. Again, a shear band develops where localization, where grain growth proceeds, but this localization is more confined for the hydrogen charged samples. And I think this is probably a very interesting part for the brittle man community, because it seems that for cyclic loading conditions in such nanostructures, the enhancement of dislocation activity might not be very, very, very prominent. This methodology is sensitive also to different hydrogen concentrations. I would like to draw your attention now on the bottom side. We have here the samples cycled to 50 cycles, so uncharged, low hydrogen concentration, and in red now the high hydrogen concentrations. We do see the difference in the hydrogen concentration now also in an increased cracking tendency. So also the hydrostatic pressure cannot prevent cracking anymore at such high concentrations. But what we also see is that after 50 cycles of HBD, a higher hydrogen concentration can prevent grain growth. It stabilizes the grain boundaries, which was not possible for the lower hydrogen concentration. What we assume, so yeah, you see this also here, but what we actually assume is the following. When the overall hydrogen concentration is raised inside the sample, in this BCC ion structure, it seems that more hydrogen atoms can segregate to the grain boundaries. This compares very well also to modeling data, showing for higher hydrogen concentration, not only the octahedral sites with the low segregation energy occupied, also tetrahedral sites. So if we increase the overall number of hydrogen at the grain boundaries, pinning forces are increased, which are able to prevent boundary migration also at very large driving forces. So with this, I would like to conclude. What I actually wanted to show you is for nanostructured materials, we have an indirect assessment tool to make hydrogen visible inside the sample. We can study the interaction with grain boundaries at different strain rates, but also for different hydrogen concentrations. And what is interesting, or what was interesting for us, was that hydrogen rather reduces localization effects than enhancing dislocation plasticity in this material type. And with this, I would like to come to an end and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.